funded, crowdfunded film. So thanks to all of you. And also thanks to Dr. Jen Bravo, who's here assisting, who's on our board, and who is going to be kind of looking at the questions you guys send in. And she will read them and so that you can hear them, and then I will answer them. And also to the people at Never Ending Light and Lori Knapp, who's sort of doing the logistics for this call. I think the first thing I'd like to go into for just a little bit, there have been a lot of questions about the production of the film and going forward after the horrible tragedy that befell Arm Kalika's father at the Sikh temple. And as you know, if you follow my blog, we are moving full steam ahead with the production. Of course, Arm's spent a few weeks with his family, as is expected, there in outside Milwaukee, giving them support and helping his mom and family get through this really terrible time. And all of our thoughts and prayers have gone out to them and to the whole Sikh community, who are a very peace-loving, wonderful group of people who tragically had this monstrous act befall them. And it just speaks more to the fact that we need to transform our civilization from its current madness into a civilization that begins to act civilized, and I think that's really a big part of the message of what we want to provide in this film, Sirius. So we are moving full steam ahead. In about 9 days, Arm Kalika and the production team is going to be here in Virginia and in Washington, D.C. We're going to be doing actually a senior contact event here with our senior team at our farm in Virginia, and also interviewing new military and corporate witnesses for the film, ones that are in addition to the dozens that we have from the Disclosure Project. And we're also going to be in Washington filming various sites and places to include in the film. So when we're here at my house, we have a vast archive of, as most of you know, over 110 military and corporate top-secret witnesses. We have several thousand pages of top-secret documents. We have hundreds of videos and photographs of extraterrestrial vehicles and a few of so-called alien reproduction vehicles, the man-made ones. And we have a whole lot of other evidence here, such as radar tapes, FAA tapes, and other materials that the production team will be going through with us, and our senior team. We'll have about a dozen people out here over the Labor Day weekend. So, yeah, just so that you all know, the production is going full steam ahead, and that's going to be followed by something all of you are invited to, if you can get to it, and that's the Sirius lecture event that I will be doing in Santa Monica, California on September 16th. Information is at sirius.neverendinglight.com, and what we're going to do with this is it's a little similar to what Al Gore did with An Inconvenient Truth, but I hope it's, of course, much better than that was. And that is, I will be doing a sort of tour de force of information of disclosure, new energy, anti-gravity technologies, and contact experiences, as well as the whole concepts of transdimensional physics and the science of consciousness, in a presentation there at the Broad Street Theater in Santa Monica, California. And basically, we're putting this on as sort of a live event. It's going to be very professionally filmed with state-of-the-art cameras and crew. And that's going to be a thread that moves through the entire 2-hour film, and then around that will be built other witness interviews, disclosure witnesses, documents, contact events, and other materials that we have. And so we want this to be a very successful live event. It will be a part of the history of the movie, and if any of you are in the area of that part of the United States and can make it, you're certainly invited, and I hope to see you there. I know a number of people who are on this call tonight are planning to be there. So that's a big event coming up that we're preparing for as well. And then within the next month or so, Dr. Bravo and myself and Emery Smith, who is the CEO of Insight Corporation, which is a biotech company, who's on our senior team, as well as a very senior tenured professor of genetics at a major Ivy League university. we'll be further studying the possible extraterrestrial life form being that we have discovered or had brought to us, I should say. We did not discover it. This particular little being is a young being. We do not know for sure that it's extraterrestrial. It certainly is not a hominid, meaning it's not a prehistoric, pre-Homo sapien or pre-human form. That's been ruled out, and it's not old enough anyway to be like a Lucy-type creature or Cro-Magnon or what have you. It's also not any known other primate. The question becomes, is it a miscarried or aborted fetus with a massive amount of skeletal and other anomalies from some type of defect, either genetic or congenital? And so far, no one has been able to identify such a syndrome that this would conform to. Moreover, there are so many aspects of the skeletal system that are symmetric but very, very atypical of humans that it's highly suggestive that this is possibly the real thing. If it is, of course, this would constitute one of the biggest disclosures possible. So we feel obligated to try to pursue this and to the extent possible get some answers. So part of what we'll be doing, we will be going to a foreign country, which I cannot disclose because the request of the people who have this particular little being. And we will be doing MRIs on this body. Dr. Bravo and I personally examined this being last few years. When I was brought into this case because I'm a medical doctor and also the head of the Disclosure Project and CSETI, and the people knew that we had some knowledge of the subject as well as medical expertise. And I can assure everyone that it is a true biological specimen and not a hoax of any kind. The question becomes a biological specimen of what? And we probably are going to have to pursue this as a process of exclusion, meaning that we will have to exclude any known human genetic or congenital anomalies phenotypically or clinically from its appearance, but also then genetically as well, and with the DNA and doing a full DNA study on it. There are specific markers to look for that are very important, and we will be consulting and have been consulting with this extremely accomplished and renowned geneticist who is offered to help us with this pursuit. And we're very, very lucky indeed to have a person of this caliber assisting us with this, as well as the rest of our scientific team. Dr. Ted Loader, who's our science advisor, and Emery Smith and Dr. Bravo and myself will all be very intimately involved. We're also going to get really detailed state-of-the-art MRI studies where we can see the internal structures. Now, what Dr. Bravo and I were able to see when we handled and examined this little being back a couple years ago is that there is neural tissue in the cranial vault or the skull that we could see. It also has a very, very different skeletal structure. It has a different, totally different orbit, skull bones, 10 ribs, very different lower and upper extremity of the forearm and the lower leg. They're just very numerous, probably a few dozen major things that do not conform to a human, and yet it's not asymmetrical or deformed in any way. It's obvious that this little being died of some trauma because there's a skull fracture that's obvious to the right, sort of behind where our ears would be, mastoid area, and the jaw and the head is a bit contorted due to the trauma. So from all appearances, this little being died of some traumatic event. Now, we're not going to speculate beyond that because we really have no idea how this little being met its demise. And so at this point, all I'm trying to report to you is that this is what we know at this point, and we'll have more information as we get further detailed X-ray, MRI, and genetic studies, which we are certainly planning to pursue. So those of you who have been making some additional contributions to the serious.neverendinglight.com site to help with that, we appreciate it. I mean, luckily we have some of the best experts in the world working on this without charge, pro bono as it were, Dr. Bravo and myself and Mr. Smith and this geneticist. But there's a lot of other lab and MRI and other studies that are going to be substantial in their cost, not to mention getting the team to this country and going through this. So we do appreciate your support, and you're going to make this possible. We're also pursuing a number of other very important leads. Now, a number of you have asked about the so-called star child skull. This is something I've known about for a very long time, but it wasn't until 2012 that some of the more advanced genetic tests were done. And I will say that these recent tests show that this has possibility for us to pursue further, and we will reach out to those folks and see if that's something possible to further test. I think that the people we have involved could do further genetic testing and confirmatory testing of some of the genetic anomalies that have been now proven in the last year or two. And I think that if we can pursue that, we will have another bit of evidence. But again, these are all things to be determined, and we're going to be conservative in how we pursue these sorts of things so that we include only things that we have high confidence in, such as the testimony of some of the disclosure witnesses like John Callahan, who brought us the originals of the FAA tape of the massive UFO that was tracked over Alaska by the 747 Japan Airlines case. We have many cases like this that we want to include in the film. We have a lot of other really fantastic archives. Paula Harris, who's been involved with this subject since the days of J. Allen Hynek, the famous Project Blue Book guy who much to his dismay later, called these things swamp gas. And, of course, then Congressman Gerald Ford went ballistic and had hearings in the House of Representatives because of that unfortunate, or in some senses fortuitous comment, but who later, of course, as you all know, Dr. J. Allen Hynek pretty much came clean on this, saying that this was clearly something real and not swamp gas. And so Paula Harris has an interview with him and with Colonel Corso and with Minister of Defense Paul Hellyer, who I've worked with closely, of Canada, and others, and she's bringing her entire archive. It's also very exciting that Dr. Lynn Katai has a number of photographs and videos from the Phoenix Lights, which many of you may know was a CSETI CE5, although the UFO public generally does not know this. I was there when that happened, and it was a vector, and we were preparing for the 1997 briefings for members of Congress, and I was there in Phoenix at a digital lab putting together the best photographs and videos that were extant at that time around the world for us to give to members of Congress for this briefing, where we had this early gathering of top-secret witnesses and astronauts and what have you, and we had done a protocol to vector in and invite an ET event that would be unmistakable and could be noted by a large number of people. And that very night, of course, is when the Phoenix Lights happened. And the epicenter of it was actually right over the lab where Sherry Adamak, who has, of course, since passed away, God bless her, and I were doing all this work on this till the wee hours of the morning, actually, each night on this best available evidence that we were putting together for Congress. So, this is not a coincidence. And, of course, years later, Dr. Katai, who's also a medical doctor, and I met, and we posted her at some of our conferences, and we shared stories. And many people do not realize that there is an interactive CE5 contact component to the experiences that she has had before and after the Phoenix Lights, and that further proves that there are technologies that ETs have that interface with consciousness and coherent thought, and in fact that they have consciousness-assisted technologies, which means that their consciousness interfaces with their own communication and propulsion and guidance systems, but they also have technology that assists consciousness, that assists in such things as what the pop culture might call remote viewing, and which the ancients would call just being a seer. But the reality is that these are all sciences. It's in the realm of the science of consciousness. And many people don't realize that this is really the core of the big leap that we need to take in the next 1,000 years or so, is the study of the science of consciousness, because by the middle of the 20th century, by the mid-1950s certainly, we already had operational free energy and anti-gravity systems, but these were absconded and suppressed by those in the intelligence and so-called military-industrial complex, operative word industrial and financial complex, that did not want this information out. And this is going to be part of the expose of Sirius, is that most people do not understand what's behind the secrecy. And I think that it's very easy to present evidence. It's very easy to present the thousands and thousands of cases that we have and witness testimony. What's really hard for most people to wrap their mind around is both the how and the why of the secrecy. And the hardest question always to answer, as the Enigma song says, is to answer why. And in this case, I remember many years ago briefing the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, R. James Woolsey, and I thought I was going to spend all my time proving to him UFOs were real. And he stopped me after 10 minutes. I had this big portfolio and briefcase full of goodies. And he said, "Stop. I don't need to hear that. I already know these are real." My wife and I had had a sighting in New Hampshire years ago in the 60s, I believe he said. However, I'm the CIA director, and the president and I aren't being told anything about this. And this was the hardest thing for him to understand, is why was he being denied access? And this was the same question put to me by Lord Hill Norton, the head of the Ministry of Defense. It was the same question put to me by the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who I will reveal to this conference call right now, was General Patrick Hughes, a three-star general that you frequently saw with Bill Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who I personally briefed for an extensive period at the Pentagon. And this was also the question that Admiral Tom Wilson, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, J2, asked, and that is, if we don't know, who the hell does, and why is this being kept secret? And to each of them I had to explain, well, this is the blackest of black projects, and they don't want you to know because you guys are the white hats and the good guys who do exist in the military and government. Many of them are honest and good people. But they know that if you knew the truth about this, that you would not go along with the secrecy. And one of the things that people have a very hard time understanding, and particularly in the UFO subculture, and I hate to use the word conspiracy subculture, is that it's not as vast a conspiracy as people think, because 99% of the folks that you would think would know about this, whether it's a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee that I briefed or others, really, honest to God, don't know. And the folks who do know are these devils who are hell-bent on keeping it secret, because its revelation would mean the end of the world as we know it, to quote the REM song. And I feel fine, because what that means is that we would, in less than a generation, be rid of all centralized utilities, all electric power grids, all internal combustion engines, jet engines, rockets, oil, gas, coal, nuclear power. All of it is obsolete and has been obsolete for more than 60 years. And I think that this becomes the $600 trillion macroeconomic question, the $600 trillion macroeconomic question. And this was actually the central discussion that Minister of Defense Paul Hellyer of Canada and I had, because he was, before in his career, a macroeconomic specialist and a macroeconomist. And he came to the conclusion many years ago that the gangbanksters and the central banks and the financial system, in bed with the industrial and corporate military world, do not want this out because of the fact that it would be such a large change in the way the world runs. We would no longer be in a petrodollar system, because petroleum would not be relevant except for plastics and synthetics and things of this sort. And so the price of oil would go down from $100 a barrel down to maybe $5 or something like that. It costs less than $3 a barrel to pull it out of the sands of Saudi Arabia. And if you weren't burning it as fuel, you would need very, very little of it. And so, really part of what we have to do with this film, Sirius, is connect these dots, because it hasn't been done. Usually people stick with sort of only the evidence, but the evidence doesn't hang together unless you can explain the secrecy. But then you have to take another step, and you have to explain what the science and technology is and where this energy is coming from, trans-dimensional physics. And then you have to take another step and say, why are these visitors here? How do we make contact? And how does it get actuated? And, of course, this is where the expertise that CSETI has. Most of you know for 22 years we have led expeditions around the world, and we have never had an expedition to make contact where we have not had contact occur, albeit it is often strange. It often is something that is on the trans-dimensional level and very, very different from what most people would think. The other part of this is that we have to expose the big hoax that has been going on for many, many years, probably over 50 years, involving trying to portray the ET presence as a threat. And as most of you know, General Douglas MacArthur, in his last address to Congress back in the 50s, said that World War III will be interplanetary. Werner von Braun told Carol Rosin that there was a massive attempt to portray that there would be a threat from outer space, and that this would follow the Cold War, and that it would also then follow a global terrorism, which, of course, this was came out before 9/11, because we did the National Press Club event for the Disclosure Project in May of 2001, and, of course, that September 11th is when 9/11 happened. And the whole world now knows that there has been, in the last 10 or 11 years, trillions of dollars spent on terrorism, but that the big card that they've been holding back, where they're going to try to unite the world around a military junta, is to portray that there's an alien invasion. And as most of you have followed in the last year, aside from the 18 or so movies that have come out of Hollyweird, as we call it, that portray this sort of imminent invasion by aliens like Battle Los Angeles and other nonsense. You've had people like Stephen Hawking and others in the defense industry at Lockheed Martin who have written books and a number of other pretty high-profile articles in the mainstream media talking about preparing for this so-called alien threat. And I think this is another thing. It's a manipulation, but they're desperate that this be part of the narrative, because they really want to grow the military-industrial complex from the couple $1 trillion a year that it now is globally to much more than that. And they want to be able to unite the world through fear instead of through peace, and through universal peace and love and our common roots. And this is exactly why the movie Sirius is so important. It has to be a different perspective on this from what you would pick up at a UFO conference or on the History Channel or out of the Hollywood and mainstream media sphere. And for years we wanted to do it, and it wasn't until the crowdfunding capabilities kicked in that we thought, well, maybe this can be done now. And no studio would touch it, and now we can do it. So thanks to all of you on this call. We're moving forward. And the other wonderful thing that came forward is that Dr. Bravo and I met with Arm Kalika. He contacted us back last fall, and we were actually coming back from a contact expedition that we were conducting in this vast wilderness in Southern California called Anza Borrega State Park. It's a 700,000-acre wilderness. Actually, we're going to be back there in November, those of you who want to join us. And we were contacted by this Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, and Mr. Kalika wanted to meet, and I was frankly exhausted and skeptical. And I've had, I won't even go through the list of A-list Hollywood people who've approached us over the years, but who ultimately can't get a movie like this done. And so we met, and after kicking some ideas around this spring, came up with the idea, well, look, no one's going to put the kind of big money that Hollywood puts into this stuff, because it's not going to be xenophobic and negative and the alien invasion nonsense that is the stock and trade of this subject in the mainstream media. And so we decided, well, what if we try this whole crowdfunding idea? Because that didn't exist a couple years ago, and it exists today. And we kind of experimentally thought, well, we don't know. Usually to do a feature film like this with this much evidence and research that has to go into it is a couple $1 million. And, in fact, that was the quote given to me back in 10 years ago by an Oscar-nominated documentary guy. And we knew we weren't going to be able to probably pull in that much, but we said, well, what if we could do a reasonably good and comprehensive treatment of the subject that could get out to the public and eventually go viral with much, much less, because we've already done 22 years of research. And frankly, for every dollar you folks have contributed, there's at least $10 in previously existing research, filming, evidence that's been accumulated. In other words, if you gave $100, it's really like giving $1,000, because we have such a massive archive, and we have people cooperating from all over the world who have other archives and photographs and cases, all of which can be brought to bear for this project. And that's all already in the can. And that's already been, a lot of it already filmed, shot, and done. So a lot of this is about assembling it all and doing a very good sort of what they call post-production treatment of it that can be compelling. Now, I have to say that the filmmaker and I are all kind of daunted by the task, and this really needs to be about 31-hour episodes of a whole season to cover it even superficially. So to try to cover the extent of this material in a 2-hour film is a tour de force. But remember, we're not doing this for UFO aficionados and people who are steeped in UFO lore. We're really doing this so that, like the Disclosure Project did, it breaks out of that subculture and reaches literally millions, if not a billion or two people around the world. And that is our objective. And so, in a sense, if you look at it, what we're really wanting to do is have this as a story that is fast-paced and moving and grabs people, and not, hours and hours of talking heads like you might see on PBS or the History Channel. And for that, we really do need someone who creatively can do that, and that's what Arn Kalika can bring to this, certainly we cannot. And so we're really very excited that he did agree to do this with us, and we're in the full production phase right now. So that's sort of the big picture of what we're doing. I know a number of you have sent in questions. I'm going to sort of entertain some now if Dr. Bravo wants to relate some of them.
Okay. The first question is, I've seen videos that claim crop circles contain blueprints to some unknown technologies. What can you say about messages from crop circles?
That's a great question. And, there's so many sections of this story. And as most of you know, Colin Andrews and I have been very good friends since the early 90s. And I started going over to the crop circles in 1992. And while many people have said that this is part of a sort of a technological expose, I have no knowledge that that's the case. What I do know is that experiencing the real crop circles as opposed to man-made ones, which increasingly many of them are man-made, they have a sort of archetype effect within the structure of consciousness. And what I mean by that is that it's not a linear language like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, or a language like Sumerian. It's more like a mandala, if you understand what a mandala is in the ancient Vedic concept, a design that has an effect in awareness, but a very specific one. And I think that there are sacred geometric forms that may and do, in fact, have technological implications, but it's not as literal as people have wanted to make. It's actually an awakening in consciousness at a deep archetype level. And, if you understand the Vedic sciences, consciousness is an omnipresent, non-local field of awareness. Within that, at a very, very fine level, there's a level called Ritambara Pragya, and that's a Sanskrit word, Ritam, for a fine level of consciousness, just this side of the unbounded component that's in the relative, but where knowledge and forms and sciences and art exist in a pre-existent state, but that can be experienced by consciousness. What I think is happening with the authentic crop circles is that it's reaching into a very deep level of that structure in consciousness and enlivening it. And I think that that's a very, I know many people would not have that perspective, but that's just our own experience from having been in these crop circles for 20 years and done contact work. And as most of you know, in 1992, the CSETI logo, which is an equilateral triangle consisting of 3 circles connected by lines, that was actually a contact event where we visualized that form. If you go to cseti.org, you'll see it in kind of 3 dimensions. And we visualized that and contacted the ETs and asked them to create a crop circle that would look like that form. No one in the world knew that form until we actually arrived there on Woodborough Hill in Alton Barnes that night, because we had not even decided what we were going to project mentally through mental imaging to the ETs. The next morning, a farmer found exactly what we had visualized and sent to the ETs in a field. And it's interesting because back then there was a group being funded by Robert Bigelow, the Bigelow Aerospace, that was looking into crop circles and doing various studies. And I was told by people, scientists on that team, that the anomalies found within that particular crop circle were the most authentic of that year. But because it was a CSETI CE5, it was sanitized out of the report for 1992. So there's always a cover-up to the truth. And that's what happened. And that was the same year where in a field just a few feet from where we made this contact and visualized and asked the crop circle makers, if you want to call them that, these trans-dimensional ET beings, to make this crop circle that's now the CSETI logo, where we continued these protocols and then had about 100-foot diameter disc float into the field in the mist. And so that, of course, is ancient history. But ultimately, you know, the events, the CSETI CE5 events that happened near Pensacola, Florida in 1992, the contact that happened in Belgium in 91, the events that happened last week on Mount Shasta, which we actually filmed, with these luminous objects coming out of the volcano of Mount Shasta, and other events that were directly overhead. We had 360 high-resolution filming going on the entire time we were out there. Some of these are going to make their way into the serious film, and it's not going to be what people expect. It's quite extraordinary, because when you have to understand that if you can go from the Andromeda galaxy to here, which one of these civilizations we've had contact is from there, you're 2.5 million light years from the Milky Way if you're from Andromeda. Well, that's the distance that a beam of light goes at 186,000 miles a second for 2.5 million years. So at the speed of light, it would take you 2.5 million years to get to Andromeda and 2.5 million years to get back. That's 5 million years. Nobody lives 5 million years. I don't care. Ain't Moses, nobody. So basically, even in our own Milky Way, which is 100,000 light years across, 1% of the way across the Milky Way is 1,000 years, 1,000 light years. So it would take 1,000 years to get there at the speed of light, which is much faster than the space shuttle or this Curiosity thing we just put on the Mars surface, and another 1,000 years to get back. And that's only 1% of the way across our Milky Way galaxy. What that means is that even in our galactic neighborhood, never mind other galaxies, the speed of light is just way too slow. And so when you start talking about very high voltage systems that enable a spacecraft and its occupants to drop out of linear space-time, they have to go interdimensional or transdimensional. But so do their communication systems, which means they're interfacing with the visual component of thought, which many of the mystics in the old days would call astral. So when you guys have a flying lucid dream, guess what? You're about in the same dimension as an ET vehicle is when it's hovering dematerialized in the atmosphere or in your backyard, or going from Andromeda to the Milky Way and back. And so if you this has got to get understood. One of the problems in the whole UFO subculture is that people are still running around wanting to kick the tires when we should be 50, 60 years into understanding an entirely new paradigm of a quantum conscious holographic universe. And this is where the work of Goswami and people like Larry Dossey and people like Dr. John, who ran the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the Peer Lab, who I spoke with personally when he was still living, and people like Bruce Lipton and Rupert Sheldrake, who talks about morphogenic fields. This is where that work meets interstellar transdimensional. And that understanding and our contact work is going to be the sort of finale of the film series, because we want to live people with a vision of not only humans making contact, but eventually traveling amongst the stars in peace, but also advancing in higher states of consciousness, without which we cannot even bring these technologies out. Because if we bring these technologies out with the consciousness of division and what happened at the Sikh temple and what's happening now all over the world with warfare and racism and homophobia and gay bashing and bullying and warfare after warfare, those technologies will only do more damage. Even though they don't pollute, they can be weaponized. And I remember recently having a conversation with a colonel at the Air Force who was in charge of, and get this euphemism, a wonderful, future technologies for the Air Force. That was his title. And this colonel had the conversation with me and said, look, you know, these sciences and technologies can be weaponized. I said, yes, and I all but said, you bastards have already done that. That's what you're using in these classified weapon systems to target and shoot down extraterrestrial vehicles. And I said, however, if we don't bring them out, we're going to destroy the biosphere with 7 billion people using fossil fuels. If we do bring them out and we don't have a complete change in our consciousness that's based on universal principles, peace, and using these technologies for the good of the human race and not for militarism, then we're also sunk. So we're at the horns of a dilemma, the biggest dilemma humanity's been in. It's an existential crisis in the truest sense of the word. And that's why this film has to convey this existential crisis, but in a way that presents not just the problem, but the solutions. And part of the solution is this understanding of consciousness on higher states of consciousness and what the message is that's within the crop circles about the nature of mind and space and time. And much of this is, of course, very, very arcane to some people. We're going to try to find creative ways to express it and just sort of crack the door open, and that's about all you can do. But then what we really want to be able to do, of course, if we have the funding, this is probably another $20,000 or $30,000, is to develop a multimedia, very high-tech website, which all of you know who've gone to disclosureproject.org and cseti.org, we do not have, because those sites have all been built by, frankly, volunteers and amateurs, because we really don't know what we're doing because we've never had the funding to do it properly. But if we had some funding to do that and expertise to do it, we need a real web architect. Anyone listening who's a professional, I mean top of their game, web architect, we need you. But at some point, if it has to be hired out, we can. But what we'd really like to do is that when we have this film, people will be able to get it, and then within the film, and then within the DVD, or if it's streamed, or however we end up rolling this out, people will be able to go and click on witnesses and testimony, and there'll be dozens of top-secret military people, photos, hundreds of photos, CSETI contact, dozens or hundreds of photos and videotape, as well as the protocols. Documents, the best government documents, some of which have not been declassified, but which I possess, and which will be in this film. So that's kind of what we can do if we had somebody with the skill to do it. I'm just a country doctor here in Virginia, and I don't know nothing about birth and no websites, but if somebody can give birth to this one, it'd be awesome. And that's certainly something we plan to do if we can. I mean, one of the things, folks, all of you listening, that you need to be disabused of something. There's no big office building here filled with staffers. It's a handful of volunteers, unpaid, doing this in their spare time, so and what they can. And so Unfortunately, that's just the reality. Luckily, we have raised enough funds to have this production team at Never Ending Light on a full-time basis here for a few months to create and shoot and produce and post-produce and make beautiful this film. But we really need all the help we can get from folks, and a lot of it is kind of gifts in kind if people have real expertise in this area. And to folks who are already volunteering, I say thank you, and to those who may have expertise, let us know.
When they see a UFO, how can people identify if it is a real extraterrestrial craft or a human craft that was reverse engineered from a downed ET craft?
Very good question, and this is a very frequently asked question that on CSETI expedition events. In fact, it was asked to me some years ago. I was meeting with a Hollywood producer who's, I won't say his name here, I guess, but let's just say top tier director and producer in Hollywood, and he had an encounter some years ago of an extraterrestrial craft that was very luminous, not quite fully materialized, and the craft itself seemed conscious. Now, here's something, hope you're all sitting down. The actual extraterrestrial vehicles are bio-nano machines that have artificial intelligence to the point that they are actually conscious. The men that I've spoken to have been on retrieval expeditions where we have downed actual ET vehicles, have all said not only are they like living organisms, they are themselves conscious and are imbued with that consciousness through an interface with their inhabitants, the ETs that created it. So we're not talking about your granddad's Oldsmobile here or your Boeing 747. In contradistinction, a so-called alien reproduction vehicle, which is actually something that is a advancement in anti-gravity technologies that began to be studied in the 1920s by T. Townsend Brown and others, as well as the Kolosky-Frost experiment that was reported in a mainstream journal in Germany in 1928 or 29, and then was further developed by World War II Germany, the Nazis, where they did have anti-gravity devices that they were testing but didn't quite get finished before we developed the atomic bomb. Those were all going forward without any reverse engineering of ET vehicles. However, after World War II, when they began to deploy the scalar or longitudinal kind of Tesla-type coil weapons inside radar domes, and we were able to begin to knock a few of these ET craft down, quite tragically and stupidly, I might add. And by the way, that's what Roswell was. We have a document from a field agent from Guy Hotel to J. Edgar Hoover talking about the Roswell event as they had switched on a quote-unquote new radar system, which is a euphemism for these kind of electromagnetic pulse systems. There at Roswell, and two of these ET craft collided. One was blown to smithereens northwest of Roswell. The other one continued on a westward trajectory and impacted near Socorro, New Mexico, and was more intact, although broken apart. One of the men that I interviewed years ago who did not want to go on the record, who arrived there, saw that this gash that was in the side of the ET craft was trying to heal, like if you've seen time-lapse of videos of a cut on human skin healing where it goes very fast. That's what it was actually trying to do, and it was trying to heal itself. He said this thing was living. And I said, yeah, of course they are. They're electromagnetic, but they're also nanobiotechnology. And I've met with people in Classified Project who've worked on these sort of nanobiotechnologies. It's quite elegant. But the things that we have been building are in the post-1947 to 1955 era, a combination of electromagnetogravitic developments that happened from the 20s through the 40s, combined then with studying and quote-unquote reverse engineering, which is what Colonel Corso was talking about, of ET materials that we began to acquire through these tragic electronic weapon downings of ET vehicles. I assure you these objects do not come through interstellar and intergalactic space, lose their way over the Mexican desert, and then just run into each other. These were things that were done, and people forget that by the 40s and 50s there were highly classified and very well-developed electromagnetic warfare systems, and they're still classified 70 years later. But when you see one of these, and they're made out of Palmdale and Lockheed Martin Skunk Works and out of the outback of Australia there at Pine Gap in an underground facility and other places, these have rivets. They're made by digging up metal and putting them together, and they have very advanced, but they're very different from an ET vehicle, which is seamless, has no rivets, has a conscious living component to it, and looks very different because even the light coming from an ET vehicle is coming from such pure elements because they're being manufactured through a sort of infra-ultrasound, I call it, or sonic resonance that brings in from one dimension into linear space-time. And the ETs are not going and digging up iron ore or titanium, smelting it and putting something together. They're actually materializing these from a template that some say would be coming from consciousness, but it was an electronic aspect of consciousness that then brings these into linear space-time. We really know how these ET manufacturing systems work, but this is probably beyond the scope of this call, however fascinating it may be. But my point is, the ET vehicles versus the ones coming out of Lockheed Martin and Northrop and the work at SAIC and MITRE Corporation and Atlantic Research Corporation and others, these particular man-made ones are obviously machines. And when this producer told me about a subsequent contact he had, it was in the, I think they're pronounced Unita Mountains there outside of Provo, Utah, in the mountains of Utah. And he was with a producer, and they were driving through the mountains, and suddenly this machine floated by, silent, anti-gravity, but he says it had parts, it had rivets, he says it absolutely looked like a man-made thing. I said, well, of course it was. That the most top-secret facilities are in underground places outside Provo and the Dugway Proving Grounds. Forget Area 51. That's so 1968 and 1970s. I want to vomit. But to be frank, the real action is in these other places, although no one talks about it. And that's where he was. He was on the outskirts of that, and here this thing came floating by, and he was so shocked. He said it was so obvious it was man-made in contradistinction to this luminous, conscious thing that was beautiful that he had had an encounter with years before then. And so, but he was just asking me to confirm, was that one a man-made? Do we have those machines? I said, oh, absolutely. We've had them flying around since at least the 1950s and early 1960s, fully operational. By the way, I always think of this when I'm just came back from the West Coast and on a 5-6 hour flight. I was thinking, oh, my God, this should be a 10-minute thing. Forget Virgin America, as nice as it was. It would be much nicer if we had one of these alien reproduction vehicles and could just go here and there. And someday we will. By the time George Jetson was zipping around in that cartoon, folks, we actually already had that stuff. And that's what's really funny about art, sometimes really imitating life.
Are new high-level witnesses still coming forward for disclosure?
There are new high-level witnesses that approach very frequently, every week or two. Most of them do not want to go on the record. I will give you an example. I just spoke today to a man who had been on an interagency committee that was in charge of planning a cosmic 9/11. And this man was actually fully versed by 1974 on using ARVs and other what they call stagecraft to hoax an attack on the planet that is 100% human, but that would fool 99.99% of the public, as well as our political leaders, that it was in fact ET when it wasn't. And this man spoke. He's very, very supportive of what we're doing. He is very afraid of coming forward publicly. And this always puts me in a very difficult situation. For every witness you guys might drill down on and see that we put out there, there are at least 10 that have spoken to me who are highly credible, but who do not want to come forward because of the threats that have been made against them. And even if I assure them that we have had no problems with that since everyone came out en masse, they are so traumatized by the threats. And in this case, this particular man was at the briefings that we organized for Congress in 1997, and he was whisked away in the middle of the night and left a note under Sherry Adamack's door because his handlers that he had worked with in the intelligence community did not want him telling, there were chairmen of committees there from the Congress and people from the Vice President's office and from the Pentagon and other places. They did not want them to know that this man who had sat on an interagency committee planning this charade would be testifying to that. So what I'm saying to folks is, yes, we're looking for new witnesses all the time. It's certainly very useful for us to have whatever information that comes from credible sources. It's better if they're willing to come out publicly, because otherwise it's the tree that fell in the woods that nobody heard except me. And at a certain point, people are going to say, oh, well, how can that be true? It's just what Dr. Greer said. But the fact of the matter is, this has created a huge problem for me personally, is that a lot of the assessments that I have come from information and intelligence sources. In fact, Dr. Bravo and I have not too long ago met with a man at the CIA who is in charge of WSFM, Weird Science and Frickin' Magic, including this subject. And this is a man that's been straddling the fence, sort of encouraging disclosure to happen since the early 1990s, and has approached me, and that who we've met with. But, having someone like that step out of the shadows and into the public light, most of them who are tied in at that level are very intimidated from doing so. So we basically put out a call. We cannot force anyone. I, as a professional, would never betray a trust, and so I haven't. But to answer your question, yes, we have people like this coming forward all the time who are very credible. At the same point, even some of the people we have on camera now will only go so far, and then we'll say, now turn the camera off, but I want you to know this. And this is part of the problem with this. At a certain point, we have to go with what we can get. I mean, this is a civilian operation. I've always been a civilian. I've never been one red cent from the government in any way, shape, or form. I've paid plenty. But ultimately, you just have to hope these people who are very heroic, who have stepped forward, there'll be more and more who will do so. And recently, many of you heard about this CIA guy, Brandon Chase, who came forward confirming some of these accounts that he knew about. There are new people coming forward all the time. And one of the wonderful things about the effect in the last decade of Disclosure Project is now there's something like 14 countries around the world that have opened up their UFO files. I was recently at a conference where a Chilean general showed recent, I think last year, footage of ET craft materializing and dematerializing around an Air Force air show in Chile, and this was an Air Force general coming forward. As many of you know, the French Space Agency and others have opened up hundreds of thousands of documents. Denmark did so. The Mexican government had a press conference a couple years ago showing gun camera footage of one of their aircraft filming one of these objects. This has really had a huge effect. A hard nut to crack is, of course, the United States, and to a lesser extent, Great Britain and Canada. But the United States is incredibly dysfunctional. One of the things I was explaining to one of these G7 countries is that many of the people who know about this issue in other countries and who have studied it a little more openly than in the U.S., actually, or a lot more openly, come to this country and they find out that you can have someone like a CIA director or a very high official at the Pentagon who absolutely knows nothing. And this is shocking to many of these people. I said, yeah, well, it's the nature of the beast. We have a almost $1 trillion military-industrial complex. Each year there's between $100 billion and $200 billion that goes missing in the black budget that no one knows where it's going, except a handful of folks. And these so-called unacknowledged special access projects or super black projects, the amount that we lose every year in the United States is larger than the largest defense budget of any other country on earth. And that's something most people never think about, and it's something we're going to try to point out in this movie.
Do you believe December 2012 will play a role in a mass disclosure effort?
Well, it's an interesting question about it. As it turns out, the delivery date or our hopeful completion date for this film is December 2012. I don't know. I know that, frankly, it's very likely in the coming months there are going to be massive changes on this planet dealing with both contact, disclosure, and other events. Whether that particular date is a correct, precise extrapolation of something that will happen, I don't know. I do know that what we have to focus on, as opposed to fixed dates like that, is that we have to do the right thing to come together as a people, disclose the truth, bring out these sciences and technologies, insist that we make peaceful contact so that we go into the future in universal peace, not just world peace united against other planets, and that we create a whole new paradigm of understanding that includes the science of consciousness as well as these advanced electromagnetic sciences. This is the big task, and so the more we can articulate that, and in my view, this is the coming together of all the ancient great knowledge that's been lost and all the knowledge that has to come out in the next few hundred to few thousand years. My own view on this is that what the Mayan calendar and others have and the Hopi prophecies and others have talked about is that we're really at the end of one huge cycle. And there are smaller cycles within the big cycle, but it was about a 450,000-year cycle. Another cycle of evolution is opened that's a universal one. It's not just Earth, and that's about a 500,000-year cycle, the hallmark of which is universal peace, interstellar travel, and the development of transdimensional sciences, the science of consciousness, and higher states of consciousness and awareness, and true conscious evolution, not just on Earth, but where then humans become interstellar. And that's the real big picture of the future that we're moving into. And, of course, right now we're the generation, I call us the bridge generation. We kind of have come out of the death throes of this old cycle and the birth of this new one, and that's why the world is in such tumult. But what I feel is that we need to focus on the creative process of transforming the planet, creating a new civilization. And if we can come together and do that, frankly, the rest of it will take care of itself. And the stuff that's rotten and corrupt, as we're seeing already, will just implode and collapse and be shed like an old snake's skin.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Watching a documentary the other evening which showed the incredible laying of undersea gas pipelines, I had the very uneasy feeling that it's a battle to the last drop of oil and last puff of gas. How can this be turned around in time?
Well, that's a great question. And, when I first started doing briefings for senior people in Washington in the early 90s, I said, we're at the end of our runway here. The pilots called this V as in Victor 1, and that's when you've got up enough speed that you either have to shut the engines down because you're going to run out of runway, or you have to tilt and take off. So our civilization needs to take off, and we have been there for about 100 years. Since the early 1900s, we have not needed fossil fuels, and the longer we delay this, the harder it's going to be. And this is why, I've had people recently at a CSETI training, actually last week, one man who manages a $300 million fund said, look, won't this really disrupt things? I said, yes, and it will disrupt the current macroeconomic order. But if we stay on the current path, we're going to destroy the biosphere, eventually run out of the stuff, and we're still going to have to do it, except then we're going to have more and more of the population dependent on this poisonous junk called oil and gas. So it's a bit like if you've got a leak in your roof. You can ignore it for a little while. You keep ignoring it. It's going to rot your rafters, and you ignore it long enough, the whole roof's going to cave in on you. And that's where we are. And so what we have to do is what Al Gore tried to do with An Inconvenient Truth is to point out the downside of staying on fossil fuels. What he didn't do, and in spite of the fact that I personally briefed Vice President Al Gore's science advisor, Kohlenberger, is to bring out the solutions. And it isn't going to be curly cube light bulbs that you screw in. That's great. I've got a 10-kilowatt solar farm here at my house. That's it's the largest legal solar farm you can have in Virginia. But it ultimately, we're going to have to bring out these very advanced technologies that have been around since the days of Tesla, that have been ruthlessly suppressed. And the only way that's going to happen, it isn't going to be the president. I don't care who's in that White House. Clinton called the White House the crown jewel of the federal penitentiary system, the federal prison system. And he's right. And everyone I know who's been in that building knows that that is the truth. So we the people, meaning everyone on this call, everyone you know. So what you guys need to do, get on social media, Facebook, Twitter, your own websites, your own address book, your own friends and families, and say, look, link to these websites we have, serious.neverendinglight.com, cseti.org, disclosureproject.org. Get the information out and stay tuned. And one of the purposes of this film, by the way, and this was something that Arm Khalik and I discussed from the get-go, is that we hope this could do well enough and go viral enough that there would be enough mass response to this that we would be able to raise the funds to open a research and development lab to bring out these sciences and technologies independent of any government and independent of any large corporation or megalomaniacal billionaire. And I think that that is what we really have to do. We, the people, need to do disclosure. It isn't going to be the White House. We, the people, need to make contact. It isn't Hillary Clinton doing it. And we, the people, need to bring out these sciences and technologies and say goodbye to the dinosaur-era fossil fuels. And if we all pull together, we'll do it. So, again, I'm going to have to wrap this up. I want to thank everyone for your very generous contributions and for your continued support. Thank you for getting the word out. And we look forward to seeing you at the premiere and perhaps in Los Angeles on September 16th. So God bless all of you, and thank you. Bye-bye.